Welcome back, learners. Today's deep dive is going to be a fascinating one, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC exam.
Absolutely.
We're going deep into land reforms in India and the legal battles that shaped them.
Yes, and this is a topic that's incredibly relevant for
Yeah,
both prelims and mains.
totally. So get ready to take some notes because we're about to uncover some twists and turns you might not have learned in your history books.
It's true. This topic really offers a rich understanding of how India's legal landscape evolved, how social change impacted the way the Constitution is interpreted, and just how complex it is to balance fundamental rights with broader societal goals.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. We're going to be unpacking a landmark case today, Shankari Prasad Singh Deo v. Union India, which actually challenged the very first amendment to the Indian Constitution.
A really significant case, for sure. But to really grasp it,
Yeah.
we need to set the stage first.
Okay, let's do it. Take us back in time.
Imagine India in the early 1950s, freshly independent, eager to forge a new path, but also burdened by the legacy of the Zamindari system.
The Zamindari system. Okay, so for anyone who needs a refresher, this was a landholding system inherited from the British Raj. Essentially, vast tracts of land were controlled by a small number of zamindars,
Right.
who often had the power to extract exorbitant rents from the farmers who were actually working the land.
It was a deeply exploitative system. Let me put it this way. Imagine you're a farmer working tirelessly on land that you don't even own. You produce crops, but a huge chunk of your harvest goes straight to the zamindar as rent.
Oof, leaving you with barely enough to survive, I'd imagine.
Exactly. This system was a major obstacle to progress. It fueled rural poverty and inequality.
So it's no surprise then that land reform was a top priority for the newly independent Indian government. After all, Articles 39B in the Constitution clearly talk about equitable distribution of resources and preventing the concentration of wealth.
Absolutely. Abolishing the zamindari system was seen as a crucial step towards actually achieving those goals.
Right.
But it wasn't going to be easy.
Of course not.
The government needed a legal framework, a way to carry out these reforms, and that's where the First Amendment to the Constitution comes into play.
Okay, so 1951, the First Amendment. This was a bold move, right? Aimed at giving the government the power to actually make these land reforms happen.
It was.
So walk us through some of the key changes that this amendment brought about.
Sure. One of the most important things was the introduction of the Ninth Schedule to the Constitution. Think of it like a shield protecting land reform laws from being challenged in courts.
Wait, so judicial review is basically
Yes.
when courts can check if a law violates the Constitution?
Exactly.
So with this Ninth Schedule, the courts couldn't even examine whether these land reform laws were infringing on any fundamental rights.
That's right. And the First Amendment didn't stop there. It also added Articles 31A and 31B into the Constitution,
Okay,
specifically to protect those land reform laws.
interesting.
Article 31A basically said, look, laws acquiring estates for land reform can't be invalidated just because they might violate someone's right to property.
Wow, so the government was really serious about prioritizing land redistribution, even if it meant kind of limiting the right to property?
They were.
That must have been pretty controversial.
Oh, absolutely. It challenged some really deeply entrenched power structures and economic interests. And that's where our landmark case comes in, Shankari Prasad Singh Deo v. Union of India.
Here we go.
Shankar Prasad himself, a zamindar, challenged the First Amendment, arguing that it violated his fundamental right to property.
So it's a classic battle, individual rights versus the collective good, the letter of the law versus the spirit of social justice. I'm hooked already. What did the Supreme Court have to say about all of this?
Well, it was a landmark decision. The Supreme Court basically said, look, there's a difference between ordinary laws and constitutional amendments. Ordinary laws can't violate fundamental rights, that's clear.
Right.
But constitutional amendments, they operate on a whole other level.
So they were saying Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution, even if it means changing fundamental rights.
Yes, that was their interpretation.
Wow. Were there any dissenting opinions?
There were a couple of judges who expressed some reservations, but the majority ruled in favor of Parliament's power to amend. They pointed to Article 13, which says that no law can take away fundamental rights.
Okay.
Their interpretation. A constitutional amendment isn't a law in the traditional sense. It's something more fundamental.
I see. So at least for now, the path for land reforms was clear, legally speaking. But this can't be the end of the story, right? This decision must have had some serious ripple effect.
Oh, absolutely. Shankari Prasad didn't just resolve one case. It opened up a whole can of worms, legally speaking.
Like, what kind of questions did it raise?
Well, if Parliament could amend fundamental rights, where was the line? What were the limits to that power? This question continued to kind of linger in the legal landscape for years to come.
So Shankari Prasad was like a catalyst. It set the stage for even more legal battles. What happened next in this saga of land reforms and constitutional law?
Fast forward a few years to 1964, we have the Sajan Singh v. State of Rajasthan case. The court basically doubled down on the Shankari Prasad decision. They upheld Parliament's power to amend fundamental rights.
So it seemed like Shankari Prasad had set a precedent and the court was sticking to it. But you mentioned earlier that there were some reservations. Did those dissenting voices from Shankari Prasad get any louder in this case?
They did. While the majority in Sajan Singh maintained Parliament's power, the dissenting judges went a step further. They started questioning whether fundamental rights, the very foundation of our democracy, should be so easily amendable.
Okay, so they were planting the seeds for a potential shift in thinking.
Exactly, and those seeds of doubt, as you put it, definitely grew. In 1967, we have the landmark case of Golak Nath v. State Punjab.
Oh, this is a big one.
Huge. In a dramatic turn of events, the Supreme Court actually reversed its stance. They declared that Parliament could not amend fundamental rights.
Whoa, that's a complete 180. So for a while, it seemed like the government's ability to pursue land reforms or any policy that touched upon fundamental rights was seriously limited.
Exactly. The Golak Nath judgment sent shockwaves through the legal and political system. It was a bold assertion of judicial power, saying fundamental rights are untouchable beyond the reach of Parliament.
Okay, so we've gone from Parliament having pretty broad amending powers to those powers being restricted when it comes to fundamental rights. Where do we go from here? Did this stalemate continue?
Well, the story takes another turn with probably the most important constitutional case in Indian history, Keshavananda Bharati v. State of Kerala in 1973.
Okay, I've heard of this one. This is the one with the massive 13-judge bench, right? The largest ever assembled by the Supreme Court.
That's the one. They had to try and resolve this conflict created by Golak Nath and figure out what the limits of Parliament's amending power really were.
So did Keshavananda Bharati completely overturn Shankari Prasad?
Not entirely. It refined it. The court introduced a groundbreaking concept called the basic structure doctrine.
Now, this is a term that any UPSC aspirant needs to know inside and out. Can you break it down for us? What does it mean in simple terms?
Essentially, the court said that while Parliament has broad powers to amend the Constitution, there are certain fundamental principles, the basic structure, that are off limits. They can't be changed or destroyed even through amendments.
So some parts of the Constitution are secret no matter what. Can you give us some examples of what falls under this basic structure?
It's not a fixed list. It's been developed over time through different judgments, but it includes things like the supremacy of the Constitution, the separation of powers, federalism, secularism, democracy itself, the core values that form the foundation of India.
That makes sense. So the court was trying to strike a balance. They acknowledged Parliament's amending power, but also drew a line in the sand to protect the very heart of the Constitution. But where did the right to property fit into all of this? Was it considered part of this basic structure?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? Did the court see the right to property as part of that basic structure, making it untouchable?
Exactly. Untouchable by amendments.
Well, the court in Keshavananda Bharati said no. The right to property, even though it was a fundamental right at the time, wasn't part of the basic structure.
So that meant Parliament could still amend it or even get rid of it completely without messing with the basic structure doctrine.
Precisely. And that's exactly what happened. It paved the way for the 44th Amendment Act of 1978, a major turning point for the right to property in India. This amendment actually removed it from the list of fundamental rights entirely.
Wow, so after all that debate and legal back and forth, the right to property got demoted. So what happened to it then? Did it just become completely unprotected?
It became a legal right protected under Article 300A of the Constitution.
Okay.
This means you can't be deprived of your property arbitrarily, but it doesn't have the same level of protection as those core fundamental rights anymore.
Got it. So UPSC aspirants, this is a key difference to remember. The 44th Amendment really changed things for property rights in India. But let's step back from the legal stuff for a second. What was the practical impact of actually abolishing the Zamindari system? Was it a success story?
Well, the impact of Zamindari abolition is a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Different states saw different levels of success. Some states like West Bengal and Kerala had a pretty smooth implementation. They were able to redistribute land to a lot of landless farmers.
So some states managed to translate those legal changes into real change on the ground. But what about the others? Where did the Zamindari abolition hit a wall? What were the challenges?
Well, that's where you see the limitations of just passing laws. Sometimes the realities on the ground is more complex. In many states, loopholes in the law, things like benami transactions where land is held in someone else's name to hide the real owner,
Sneaky.
allowed big landowners to keep control even though technically the land was transferred.
It's like a classic power struggle. Even with the best intentions, it's hard to dismantle those deeply rooted systems of power and privilege.
It is. A Zamindari abolition was a huge step towards social justice, but it also shows how complicated it is to actually implement big reforms in a diverse and often unequal society. Laws are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, you've got the social and economic realities to contend with as well.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've covered landmark legal battles, constitutional amendments, and the real human stories at the heart of it all. But before we wrap up, let's bring it back to our UPSC aspirants. What are the key takeaways they should
The
remember?
whole story of land reforms from Shankari Prasad to the 44th Amendment, it's like a masterclass in Indian constitutional law and how it's changed over time.
Definitely.
It shows that tension between individual rights and social change, the power of judicial review, and how the legislature and the judiciary work together to shape the legal landscape.
Perfect material for those UPSC essay topics. Discuss the evolution of the right to property in India or analyze the impact of Shankari Prasad on land reforms. Those would be great.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those prelims questions. The year of the First Amendment, the details of Articles 31A and 31B, the importance of the Ninth Schedule, all fair game.
It's a gold mine of UPSC relevant information. But it's not just about memorizing facts and figures, right?
Right.
It's about getting those big ideas, understanding the arguments and the nuances of how the Constitution is interpreted.
Exactly. Shankar Prasad, for example, raises questions about the balance of power. Who gets to decide where the limits are on constitutional amendments? What happens when individual rights clash with bigger goals for society? Those are the kind of analytical insights that will make your mains answers shine.
It's all about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and understanding the why behind the what. And by the way, all this knowledge comes from a great article in the Indian Express.
A must-read for anyone following current affairs, especially UPSC aspirants.
So to all our listeners out there, thanks for diving deep with us today. Remember, consistent effort and in-depth understanding, those are your keys to cracking the UPSC.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, if you found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share it with all your fellow UPSC warriors. Got any burning questions or suggestions for future deep dives? Leave us a comment below. We love hearing from you. Until next time, happy learning.